Right, so if anyone in the current UK government can outdo Keir Starmer in the sheer brazenness and utter shamelessness ranks, it's probably Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who has proven that much like his human rights barrister boss Starmer, doesn't seem to have that solid a grasp on international law either. And Lammy, for the record, is also a trained lawyer, supposedly. Well, not one for being shy about standing up for Israel in Parliament. He's taken enough in donations to be well seen as bought and paid for by much of the British public who have noticed such things, and needing little encouragement to do so from a Tory MP just as big a sucker for the blue and white state as Lamy is. Lamy has stood up in Parliament and shamelessly declared that Israel cannot be committing a genocide because not enough people have been killed for it to be a genocide. Unfortunately for Lamy, he's passed comment on what he thinks a genocide is before, and his hypocrisy on such matters, obviously having nothing to do with any donations of course, have been exposed for all to see once again, or at least they certainly will have been by the time you reach the end of this video.
Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today, as on other occasions recently, we've heard comments from the benches opposite that suggest that Israel is somehow conducting a war of annihilation, extermination and of genocide. There is obviously much suffering in Gaza, and we all accept that, but this terminology is completely inappropriate, not accurate, and is repeated by the protesters and the lawbreakers who are intimidating British Jews, as we saw again this weekend. So will the Foreign Secretary take this opportunity to say that there is not a genocide occurring in the Middle East?
Foreign Secretary.
These are quite properly legal terms that must be determined by international courts. But I do agree with the Honourable Gentleman. Those terms were largely used when millions of people lost their lives in crises like Rwanda, the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the way that they are used now undermines the seriousness of that term.
Patricia Ferguson.
Right, so that was David Lammy there responding to a quisling question, quite frankly, put to him by Tory MP and former fixer for Theresa May, Nick Timothy, though quite what he ever managed to fix during her calamitous tenure as Prime Minister is, frankly, a matter of opinion. He was, of course, stuck on exactly the same page as the pro-Zionists in Starmer's Labour government, not least Lamy himself, and in a show of just how on the same page Starmer's Labour is with the Tories, it was a very pally-pally exchange, wasn't it? Teeing Lamy up nicely to opine that there is not a genocide happening in the Middle East right now, and Lamy was, of course, only too happy to do just that, making the claim that words such as genocide are a legal definition, and that definition of what counts as a genocide is something that must be decided in a court of law, by international law. However, he then sped off on a tangent, saying that such a term was properly used only when millions died, it seemed. So he's putting a number on the scale of death required to count as genocide in which case. And he also happened to mention Rwanda, and he mentioned World War II, by which the obvious inference is to look at the Holocaust, of course, and the persecution of Jewish people then. However, it also counted for other demographics too, such as Roma communities and also the disabled, who were also targeted as not worthy of living by the Nazis. The way such terms are used now undermines the seriousness of the term, by which I read that as saying undermines the real thing. A quietly spoken load of chuff is what Lamy came out with, grossly insulting to pretty much anyone with a passing familiarity of what we've been witnessing in Gaza over the last year. Seriousness of terminology didn't stop all of those Labour figures jumping on the word anti-Semitism to bring down a former Labour leader, after all, who genuinely worked in the interest of the working class, an idea, a plan cultivated by the guy who was now Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff as that was. That term remains heavily abused in the defence of Israel, in defence of the very genocide it is committing that Lamy is quibbling over, and I'm very sorry if that offends the delicate sensitivities of people such as David Lammy and his bosom buddy there, Nick Timothy. But he's completely wrong about what counts as a genocide, and actually Lamy knows it too, because he's used the term himself before, but I'm coming back to that point in a moment. Lamy is at least correct that the word genocide has legal connotations. It is, after all, why at the beginning of this year the International Court of Justice decided in South Africa's favour that a plausible case for genocide against Israel had been proven, upon the evidence they had brought at that point. South Africa has now made a further submission just this week, a further 700 pages worth of evidence to add to their court case, covering much of what Israel has continued to do since, in defiance of court instruction and international law. So if Lamy wants to talk about international law, perhaps he should tell Israel to damn well start following it then. But then there is the part about millions of people dying to be a genocide, as he inferred, and pointed out Rwanda and World War II as his two examples of that there in Parliament in his speech, in his response to Nick Timothy. By his measure, therefore, a genocide of Gaza, the population of which was, back in October of last year at any rate, around 2 million people. Therefore, for Israel to commit something called genocide in Gaza, in his opinion at this moment in time, the entire population would have to have been wiped out, therefore, before it could be considered as such. Given the definition of genocide is actually the deliberate and systematic destruction of a national, ethnic, racial or religious group with the intent to destroy it in whole or in part, by the time it could be called a genocide, the genocide would have been completely enacted by that point. What an absolute balloon of a man he is. But look at that definition again, though, and the last part of it, in whole or in part. There is no actual number placed upon how many people have to die for something to be called a genocide. It is intent that defines genocide, and if we want to talk legalities and legal definitions, then rather than pay attention to a Burke like David Lammy, there's literally the Genocide Convention itself to look at. This is what the International Court of Justice referred to itself, this is what I will refer back to, and it is Article 2 of this that Lamy really ought to refamiliarise himself with, because it says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group, as such, A. Killing members of the group, B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Again, there are no numbers attributed to what counts as genocide here either. Lamy is an idiot, doesn't know what he is talking about, doesn't know his remit, is taking us all for fools, aided and abetted by a wally of a Tory MP. Or rather, he does know what he is talking about and is standing in Parliament intentionally misleading the nation. Pick one, it all amounts to the same thing, doesn't it? A dishonest interpretation of Israel's atrocities, which, given the tens of thousands of pounds in Israel lobbyist donations David Lammy has taken himself, imply his viewpoint, therefore, may well be a bought and paid for one. He's speaking out against an ICJ interim ruling on an ongoing court case brought by South Africa. He's going against the Special Rapporteur for Palestine, Francesca Albanese, who has said Israel is engaged in settler colonial genocide. She's also a lawyer. Clearly a better one than David Lammy is. The UN humanitarian chief Joyce Masuya has said the entire population of the north of Gaza is at risk of dying. The entire population. That would be genocide by Lamy's measure, though he'll possibly deny that on the grounds there weren't enough people there. There's only around 100,000 of them, so it can't possibly count as a genocide if they all die then. His quietly spoken demeanour hides an absolutely inhuman monster of a man. And rubbing that in further is where Lamy has opined on the matter of genocide elsewhere on previous occasions, though. He mentioned Rwanda, certainly a genocide. Even Lamy thinks so. He did bring it up, after all. 800,000 people are estimated to have died there at the top end of estimates. So not millions then, as it happens, David Lammy. How about when you stood up to commemorate the Srebrenica massacre where 8,000 people died? Again, definitely not millions there. How about in 2017 when you tweeted out, horrific, the Rohingya are facing genocide. We cannot be bystanders. Ethnic cleansing, gross human rights abuse, and a UK government too afraid to stand up and speak out. We cannot be complicit in this. Happy to be complicit in Israel genocide in Gaza, though. Corbyn was in charge of Labour then, though, so I suppose you were making the right noises then as opposed to now, showing you to be the leopard who changes his spots to suit whoever is leading Labour one moment to the next. It was a genocide committed against Rohingya Muslims by Myanmar's military, but you didn't wait for a legal precedent to be set on that before using the G word, did you? The top-end estimate of the Rohingya genocide is 43,000, which is exactly what official figures have just stated the death toll is in Gaza now. It passed 43,000 yesterday, the same day David Lammy stood up in Parliament and said what he just did on that clip you just watched. Top-end estimates, including all those who are missing, all those still buried under rubble across Gaza unaccounted for, could be in excess of 180,000 deaths now. That stat, more than anything, and Lammy's own words in relation to both Gaza and the Rohingya, damn him more than anything else as an apologist for genocide. Exactly as Mandla Mandela called him earlier this year, and which Lammy seemingly blocked his visa to visit the UK over earlier this month. Get the details not only of Lammy's apologism there, but also petulance in the face of his critics in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.